carriage wheel cracked against a stone in the road, and Elena nearly fell from her seat as the whole vehicle jolted sideways. She grabbed the doorframe with both hands, her heart pounding, certain for one wild second that the axle had broken, and she would be stranded on this dark country road, with nothing but the driver's lantern for company. The wheel held. The carriage rocked back onto the path and kept moving, faster than she wanted, faster than felt safe, toward a house she had never seen, and a man she had never met. She looked down at the dress she was wearing, and felt her stomach twist. It was too big in the shoulders, and too short at the hem, stitched together from two older gowns that did not match, one a faded green, and the other a harsh, mustard yellow. Her stepmother, Margaret, had chosen it herself, standing over her with a satisfied little smile, while her stepsisters, Clara and Beatrice, giggled behind their hands. "You'll look perfect for the Duke," Margaret had said, tugging the sleeve tighter so it pinched at Elena's arm. A perfect little joke. Elena had asked, more than once, what she meant by that. Margaret would not explain. She only handed Elena a folded letter, sealed with wax that was clearly not a real seal, and told her to present herself at Ashcombe Hall before nightfall, and to tell the gatekeeper she was an invited guest of Duke Alistair Renfield. "He does not know me," Elena had said. "How can I be his invited guest?" "That is exactly the point," Clara had answered, and Beatrice had laughed so hard she nearly choked on her tea. Now, sitting in the rented carriage that had cost the last coins Elena owned, she turned the folded letter over in her hands. She had not opened it. She was afraid to. Whatever cruel joke her stepmother had written inside, Elena did not want to know it before she had to. She only knew that Duke Alistair Renfield was spoken of in hushed voices throughout the county, a man who had inherited his title young, who kept to himself behind the high iron gates of Ashcombe Hall, and who was rumored to turn away every visitor who dared approach, without an invitation, earned through years of proper introduction. She was, in other words, about to arrive at the gate of the coldest, most private man in the region, wearing a dress meant to humiliate her, carrying a letter she had not read, with a story she did not understand and could not defend. The carriage slowed. Through the small window, Elena saw the iron gates rise out of the darkness, taller than any fence she had ever seen, flanked by stone pillars topped with carved eagles. Beyond them, the shape of the house rose against the night sky, its windows glowing faint gold, its towers disappearing into the low clouds. "This is as far as I go, miss," the driver called down. "You'll have to walk from here." Elena stepped down onto the gravel path, her thin shoes crunching against the stones, and watched the carriage turn and rattle back the way it had come, taking with it any hope of a quick retreat. She was alone now, standing before the gates of Ashcombe Hall, holding a letter she had not read, wearing a dress meant to mock her, and she had no idea what waited for her on the other side. A gatekeeper appeared from a small stone house built into the wall, holding a lantern that threw long shadows across his weathered face. He looked her over, from her mismatched dress to her trembling hands, and did not bother hiding his confusion. "State your business," he said. Elena's mouth went dry. She thought of turning back right there, of walking the long miles home, in the dark, rather than facing whatever humiliation waited inside. But home held nothing for her except more of Margaret's cruelty, and at least here, whatever happened, it would happen quickly. "I am told I am an invited guest of the Duke," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. The gatekeeper raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? And your name?" "Elena Whitmore." He studied her for a long moment, then glanced down at a small ledger he carried, flipping through pages by lantern light. Elena's heart sank as she watched him search for her name and find nothing. This was it, she thought. This was the moment the joke would be revealed, and she would be sent away in shame, and somehow word would reach Margaret before Elena even made it home, and the laughter would follow her for months. But the gatekeeper closed the ledger with a shrug. "Names don't always make it into my book in time. If you were sent for, best I let you through, and let the house sort it out. Not my place to turn away a lady at the door on a night like this." Elena blinked, startled by this small, unexpected mercy. "Thank you," she managed. He opened the smaller gate, built into the larger one, and gestured her through. "Straight up the path. Someone will meet you at the door." The walk up the drive felt endless. Gravel crunched beneath her feet, and on either side, dark hedges rose like walls, trimmed into perfect shapes, that seemed almost unnatural in the moonlight. Ashcombe Hall grew larger with every step, its stone face pale and imposing, its windows watching her approach like 100 quiet eyes. Elena pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, not entirely from the cold. She reached the great front doors just as one of them opened, spilling warm golden light onto the steps. A tall man in dark, formal clothing stood in the doorway, his expression polite but questioning. This, she guessed, was the steward, a man whose bearing suggested he had run this house for years and answered to no one but the Duke himself. "Good evening," he said, his eyes moving over her appearance with the same confusion the gatekeeper had shown, though he hid it better. "May I ask who is calling at this hour?" "Elena Whitmore," she said again, feeling the name grow heavier each time she spoke it, as though it did not quite belong to her anymore. "I was told I am an invited guest of the Duke." The steward, whose name she would later learn was Mr. Whitfield, said nothing for a moment. He glanced past her, toward the empty drive, clearly expecting some carriage or escort that was not there. Then he looked at her dress, her worn shoes, the letter clutched in her trembling hand, and something in his face softened, just slightly, though his voice remained formal. "The Duke did not mention an expected guest this evening," he said carefully. "Do you have anything confirming the invitation?" Elena held out the folded letter, the wax seal still unbroken. Her hand shook slightly as she did so. Mr. Whitfield took it, turned it over, studied the seal, which was clearly nothing more than a blob of colored wax pressed with a coin, rather than a proper family crest. Elena watched his face for any sign of recognition, of understanding, of the mockery she feared was about to unfold. Instead, he simply said, "I am not able to verify this letter's origin, but it is a cold night, and you have come a long way. I will not leave you standing outside while matters are settled. Please, come in." Relief and dread mixed together in Elena's chest, as she stepped over the threshold into the grand entrance hall of Ashcombe Hall. The ceiling stretched impossibly high above her, painted with faded murals of clouds and distant birds. A wide staircase curved up into shadow. Candles burned in iron sconces along the walls, and the whole space smelled faintly of wood polish and old stone. "Wait here, if you please," Mr. Whitfield said, gesturing to the center of the hall. "I will inform the household of your arrival." He disappeared through a side door, his footsteps fading into the depths of the house, and Elena was left alone in the enormous hall, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her life. She looked down at her mismatched dress again, the green and the yellow clashing horribly under the candlelight, and she felt her face burn with the shame of it. Whatever Margaret had intended by sending her here, it was working exactly as planned. Elena felt like a joke, standing in the middle of someone else's grand and beautiful home. Minutes passed. She heard low voices from somewhere beyond the side door, too quiet to make out words, but urgent in tone. She imagined the whispered conversation, the confusion, perhaps even laughter at her expense, already beginning among the staff. She thought about running, simply turning, and walking back out through the gates and into the dark, but her legs felt frozen to the marble floor. Then the side door opened again, and this time it was not Mr. Whitfield who emerged. The man who stepped into the hall moved with a quiet, contained energy, as though every motion had been considered before it was made. He was perhaps 30 years old, tall, dressed simply but with clear quality, his dark hair slightly disordered, as though he had run a hand through it in thought. His eyes found Elena immediately, and they were sharp, assessing, though not unkind. Elena's breath caught. She had never seen the Duke before, only heard descriptions of him from gossip and rumor, but she knew instantly this was Alistair Renfield. There was something in his bearing that made the grand hall around him feel smaller, as though the house existed to serve him rather than the other way around. She braced herself. This was the moment the joke would be revealed. He would look at her ridiculous dress, read whatever cruel words Margaret had written in that letter, and she would be dismissed, perhaps even mocked, before being sent back out into the night. The Duke crossed the hall toward her, his steps unhurried, his expression unreadable. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face down to her dress and back up again, though not with the cruelty she expected. There was something more careful in his study of her, almost searching, as though he were trying to understand a puzzle rather than judge a joke. Elena opened her mouth, ready to apologize, to explain, to somehow soften whatever blow was about to land. But before she could speak a single word, the Duke turned slightly and reached for a chair positioned near the wall, a heavy carved seat with a velvet cushion, and pulled it forward. "You must be tired from your journey," he said, his voice low and even. "Please, sit." Elena stared at him, too startled to move. Of all the things she had imagined might happen in this hall, this was not among them. No one had ever pulled out a chair for her in her life. Not her stepmother, not her stepsisters, not even her own father in his kinder years. It was such a small gesture, and yet it landed with the weight of something enormous, something she did not have words for yet. "Sit," the Duke said again, more gently this time, noticing her hesitation. "Whatever brought you here tonight, you do not need to stand while we sort it out." Slowly, cautiously, as though she expected the chair to be pulled away the moment she trusted it, Elena lowered herself into the seat. The velvet was soft beneath her, the wood sturdy and cool. She looked up at the Duke, waiting for the questions to begin, for the mockery she still feared might follow this strange kindness. But he only studied her a moment longer, his sharp eyes taking in the exhaustion on her face, the tremble in her hands, the mismatched dress that told its own story even before she said a word. Something shifted behind his expression, something that looked almost like understanding, though Elena could not have said what he understood, not yet. "Mr. Whitfield tells me you carry a letter," the Duke finally said, "and that you believe yourself an invited guest, though no such invitation was sent from this house." Elena's throat tightened. This was it. The truth was about to come out, and with it, whatever plan Margaret had set in motion. "I was told to come here," Elena said quietly. "I was told to say I was invited. I do not know what the letter says. I have not opened it." The Duke's eyebrows lifted slightly at that, though his expression remained calm. "You carried a sealed letter across the county on a cold night, without knowing its contents?" "I was afraid to know," Elena admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I did not want to read something cruel before I had no choice but to face it." For a moment, the grand hall was silent, except for the soft crackle of the candles in their sconces. The Duke looked down at the letter still in his hand, the crude wax seal catching the candlelight, and something hardened behind his eyes, though it was not directed at Elena. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "we should discover together what cruelty was intended, and decide together what to do about it." Elena sat frozen in the chair he had offered her, watching the Duke's fingers move toward the wax seal, feeling the whole night balance on the edge of whatever words waited inside that folded paper. She did not know, sitting there in her mismatched dress in the candlelit hall of a stranger's grand and silent house, that this single moment, a chair offered before a single word of judgment, a letter about to be opened before either of them understood its true weight, would become the beginning of everything that followed. The wax cracked easily under the Duke's thumb, and the paper unfolded with a soft, dry whisper that seemed far too quiet for the weight it carried. Elena watched his face rather than the letter itself, unable to bring herself to read the words upside down, unwilling to see her stepmother's handwriting confirm whatever cruelty she already suspected. The Duke's eyes moved across the page once, then again, slower the second time. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a small muscle flexing at the corner of his mouth. He did not laugh. He did not scoff. He simply read, and then read again, and then folded the letter closed with careful, deliberate fingers, as though handling something unpleasant that he did not wish to touch longer than necessary. "Your stepmother wrote this," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She refers to you as a gift," the Duke continued, his tone even, though something cold had crept into it, something that had nothing to do with Elena, and everything to do with the woman who had sent her. "A gift for my amusement," she writes, "since I am known to have no patience for foolish young women, and she thought it might entertain me to turn one away at my own gate." Elena felt the heat rise in her face, shame pressing down on her chest like a physical weight. She had known, somewhere in her heart, that the letter would say something cruel, but hearing it spoken aloud in the Duke's calm, measured voice made it feel sharper, more real, more humiliating than she had imagined. "I am sorry," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I did not want to come." I did not know what she had written. If I had known, I would never have. "You need not apologize," the Duke interrupted, gently but firmly. "You did not write this letter. You did not choose this cruelty. You were sent here as a joke played at your expense, not mine, and I confess, I find very little humor in it." Elena looked up at him, startled by the steadiness in his voice, the complete absence of the mockery she had braced herself for. He was not angry with her. If anything, the anger in his expression, subtle as it was, seemed aimed entirely at Margaret, at a woman he had never met and likely never would. "Might I ask," the Duke said, lowering himself into a nearby chair so that he sat closer to her level rather than looming above her, "how long you have lived under your stepmother's roof?" "Since I was 12, Elena said. "My father remarried after my mother passed. He died 3 years ago. Since then, it has only been Margaret and her daughters, Clara and Beatrice." "And this sort of treatment," the Duke said carefully, choosing his words as though testing their weight before speaking them, "is this a common occurrence in that household?" Elena hesitated. She had spent years learning to swallow her complaints, to accept whatever indignity was placed upon her without protest, because protest only ever seemed to invite worse treatment. But something about the quiet, patient way the Duke waited for her answer, without pressing, without demanding, made her feel that perhaps, just this once, honesty would not be punished. "It is not the first joke played at my expense," she admitted, "though I confess, sending me here, to your house, of all places, was more elaborate than most." The Duke's expression darkened slightly, though again, not toward her. "Elaborate, and cruel, in a way that risked genuine harm. You traveled alone, at night, to an unfamiliar house, carrying a letter meant to humiliate you before a stranger. Had the gatekeeper turned you away, or had I been a man of a harsher temperament, you might have found yourself stranded on a country road in the dark, with no way home, and no one the wiser." Elena had not considered it in quite those terms before, but hearing him say it aloud, she realized how true it was. Margaret had not simply intended a small embarrassment. She had sent Elena into genuine danger, wrapped in the guise of a joke, and had likely not spared a single thought for what might happen to her stepdaughter along the way. "I did not expect kindness," Elena said quietly, almost to herself. "I expected to be turned away, perhaps mocked, and then I would walk back to the road and find my own way home somehow, in the dark, alone, in a dress not suited to the cold." The Duke's voice remained calm, but there was an edge beneath it now, something protective and sharp. "That is not a plan, Miss Whitmore. That is abandonment, dressed up as mischief." Elena did not know how to respond to that. No one had ever spoken of Margaret's treatment of her in such direct terms before. Within her stepmother's house, the cruelty was simply the water Elena swam in, constant and unremarkable, something she had learned not to name, even in her own private thoughts. Hearing a stranger name it so plainly left her feeling strangely exposed, as though a curtain had been pulled back on something she had spent years trying not to look at directly. The Duke rose from his chair and moved a few steps away, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the windows where the dark grounds of Ashcombe Hall stretched into the night. He seemed to be considering something, weighing options in a manner Elena could not follow. "It is late," he said finally, turning back to face her. "Far too late to send you back out onto the road tonight, regardless of the circumstances that brought you here. I will not add to whatever harm has already been done by dismissing you into the dark." Elena's heart quickened. "I could not possibly impose." "You are not imposing," the Duke said, cutting off her protest, with a firmness that left no room for argument, though his tone remained gentle. "You will stay here tonight, as a guest of this house, properly and safely, regardless of the manner in which you arrived. In the morning, we will discuss what is to be done." He turned toward the side door through which he had entered and called out, and within moments, Mr. Whitfield reappeared, along with a young woman in a housekeeper's apron, whose eyes widened slightly at the scene before her. The Duke, standing near a strange young woman, in a mismatched dress, the household clearly upended from its usual quiet routine. "Lucy," the Duke said, addressing the young woman, "please see that a room is prepared for our guest, and that she is given something warm to eat. She has had a long and difficult journey." Lucy, who Elena would soon learn was one of the few maids trusted with matters close to the family, dropped a quick curtsy, though her curious gaze lingered on Elena for a moment longer than strict propriety allowed. "Of course, Your Grace, right away." As Lucy hurried off to prepare a room, Mr. Whitfield lingered, his expression carefully neutral. though Elena could sense the questions he was too well trained to voice aloud. The Duke, noticing his steward's restraint, offered a brief explanation. Our guest arrived under false pretenses, orchestrated by a family member with poor judgment and worse manners, the Duke said. She will remain with us tonight, as we sort out how best to see her safely home, or to wherever she might wish to go from here. Mr. Whitfield nodded, his expression softening slightly with understanding, though he said nothing more than, "Very good, Your Grace," before following Lucy out to oversee the preparations. Left alone again with the Duke, Elena felt the strangeness of the evening pressing in on her from every side. She had arrived expecting humiliation, and had instead found herself offered a chair, a room, a meal, and something that felt dangerously close to genuine concern, from a man she had been told, her entire life, to fear as cold and unreachable. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "You do not know me. I arrived at your gate, under false pretenses, exactly as you say. You have every reason to send me away, and forget this ever happened." The Duke considered the question for a long moment, his sharp eyes studying her with the same careful attention he had shown from the very first moment she stepped into his hall. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "because I know what it is to be sent somewhere as a joke, dressed up in circumstances not of my own choosing, and left to face the consequences alone. I did not care for it then, and I find I care for it even less, watching it happen to someone else." There was something in the way he said it, something guarded and distant, that told Elena there was more behind those words than he intended to share tonight. She did not press him. She had her own guarded places, her own histories she was not ready to hand over to a stranger, however kind he had proven himself to be, in the span of a single strange evening. "Thank you," she said instead, simply, sincerely. "For the chair, and for not laughing." Something almost like a smile touched the corner of the Duke's mouth, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "There was nothing about your arrival that struck me as funny, Miss Whitmore. Only something that struck me as wrong, and worth correcting, in whatever small way I am able." Lucy returned a short while later to lead Elena to a guest room on the second floor, a space far grander than anything Elena had ever slept in, with a soft bed, a warm fire already crackling in the hearth, and a tray of food waiting on a small table near the window. Elena sat on the edge of the bed after Lucy left, staring at the flickering firelight, trying to make sense of a night that had begun with terror and ended, somehow, in warmth and shelter she had never expected to find. She thought of Margaret, no doubt sitting comfortably at home, already imagining the humiliation Elena must be suffering, already anticipating the satisfaction of hearing the story told and retold among her circle of acquaintances. Elena wondered what her stepmother would say if she knew the truth, that instead of ridicule, Elena had been offered a chair, a warm meal, and a place to sleep by the very man Margaret had hoped would destroy what little dignity Elena had left. Whatever came next, whatever explanations or arrangements the morning would bring, Elena allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply feel safe. She did not know yet how much that single feeling would come to matter, or how far it would carry her from the life she had known before tonight. Morning light spilled through the tall windows of the guest room, and for a moment, waking in the unfamiliar softness of the bed, Elena forgot entirely where she was. She sat up quickly, her heart racing, half expecting to find herself back in her narrow room at Margaret's house, the previous night nothing more than a strange and vivid dream. But the fire had burned down to embers, in a hearth she did not recognize, and sunlight fell across a floor of polished wood, far finer than anything in her stepmother's home. And slowly, the memory of the night before settled over her again, real and undeniable. A soft knock came at the door, and Lucy entered a moment later, carrying a fresh set of clothes folded neatly over one arm. "Good morning, miss. His Grace thought you might prefer something more suited to the season than what you arrived in. I hope you don't mind." Elena looked at the simple, well-made dress Lucy held out to her, a soft gray wool with clean lines and no trace of mockery in its design, and felt her throat tighten with an emotion she could not quite name. It was such a small gesture, and yet after years of wearing whatever cast-off scraps Margaret deemed acceptable for her, the thought that someone had considered her comfort at all felt almost overwhelming. "Thank you," Elena managed. "That is very kind." "His Grace asked that you join him for breakfast whenever you're ready," Lucy added, setting the dress across a chair and moving to help Elena with the ties at the back, chattering lightly as she worked. Not that you have to hurry, mind. He's not one for rushing people, our Duke, whatever the stories say about him being cold and distant. Been in this house 8 years now, and I've never once seen him raise his voice to a soul. Elena listened with interest, curious despite herself about the man who had so thoroughly upended her expectations the night before. The stories say much worse than cold, from what I have heard. Lucy laughed softly as she finished with the ties. Stories always do, don't they? People fear what they don't understand, and His Grace keeps to himself more than most, which gives folks plenty of room to imagine all sorts of things. But he's fair, and he's kind in his own quiet way, even if he doesn't go about announcing it to the world. Once dressed, Elena made her way downstairs, following Lucy's directions through a hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, until she reached a smaller dining room, where a table had been set with a modest but warm breakfast. The Duke was already seated, a cup of tea in his hand and a newspaper folded beside his plate, though he set both aside the moment she entered. "Miss Whitmore," he said, rising slightly from his chair, in a gesture of politeness that still felt strange to Elena, unused as she was to anyone, acknowledging her presence with such formal courtesy. "I trust you slept well." "Better than I have in a long while," she admitted. Taking the seat he gestured toward. "Thank you again, for everything. The room, the clothes, the meal. I do not know how to properly express my gratitude." "There is no need," the Duke said simply. Any decent household would have done the same for a guest arrived under difficult circumstances. Elena was not entirely convinced that was true, having lived her whole life in a household that would have done nothing of the sort. But she did not press the point. Instead, she accepted a cup of tea from the servant, who appeared quietly at her elbow, and tried to settle the nervous flutter in her stomach as she considered what the day ahead might hold. "I have given some thought to your situation," the Duke said after a moment, his tone shifting into something more measured and deliberate. "And I confess, I find myself reluctant to simply send you back to a household that would orchestrate such a dangerous joke without a second thought for your welfare." Elena set down her cup carefully. "I have nowhere else to go, Your Grace. Whatever else may be true of my stepmother's household, it is the only home I have." "I understand that," the Duke said, "and I am not proposing to leave you without options. Only that we consider them carefully, rather than rushing you back into a situation that has already proven itself capable of real harm." "What did you have in mind?" Elena asked, genuinely uncertain what alternative existed for a young woman in her position, with no fortune of her own and no other family to turn to. The Duke was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the same careful deliberation Elena had noticed the night before. "I would ask that you remain here as my guest for a short while longer, under proper and respectable arrangements, of course, with Lucy and the rest of the household to see to your comfort. This would allow time for a letter to be sent to your stepmother, explaining the circumstances, and time for us to consider what might be done to ensure your safety and well-being going forward, whether that means returning to her household under better terms, or finding some other arrangement entirely." Elena's first instinct was to protest, to insist she could not possibly impose on his hospitality any longer than absolutely necessary, but something in his steady, patient expression made her pause. She thought of the dress laid out for her that morning, chosen with more care than Margaret had ever shown in 3 years, and she thought of the chair offered before a single word of judgment had been spoken, and she found herself, for once, willing to accept help rather than immediately refusing it out of long habit. "If it would not be too great an imposition," she said carefully, "I would be grateful for a little more time before returning." The Duke nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer, and turned his attention to his breakfast, though Elena could sense he had more to say on the matter, and was simply choosing his moment. Sure enough, after a few minutes of comfortable silence, he spoke again. "I should mention," he said, "that my household is not always a quiet one, whatever reputation I may have earned for solitude. There are matters I attend to daily, tenants and staff, who depend on this estate, and I would not wish you to feel confined to a single room while you remain here. You are welcome to explore the grounds, the library, whatever might interest you, provided you feel comfortable doing so." Elena's curiosity, long suppressed under years of careful, quiet behavior, meant to avoid drawing Margaret's attention, stirred at the mention of a library. "There is a library here?" "A rather extensive one. the Duke said, and for the first time, something like genuine warmth flickered across his expression, a small crack in the composed reserve he carried so carefully. My father spent a great deal of his life collecting books he rarely read, and I have spent a great deal of mine attempting to actually read them. After breakfast, the Duke excused himself to attend to estate matters, leaving Elena in Lucy's care for a tour of the house that left her increasingly astonished by the sheer scale and quiet beauty of Ashcombe Hall. Room after room revealed itself, each more impressive than the last, though what struck Elena most was not the grandeur itself, but the small signs of a household that seemed to function with genuine care rather than cold formality. She noticed the gentle way the older servants spoke of the Duke, the ease with which Lucy moved through the halls, the absence of the tension and fear that had characterized every room in Margaret's house. The library, when they finally reached it, took Elena's breath away entirely. Shelves rose from floor to ceiling, filled with books of every size and subject, and tall windows let in soft morning light that fell across reading chairs positioned near the warmth of a large hearth. She ran her fingers along the spines of books she had only ever heard mentioned in passing, novels and histories and volumes of poetry, and felt a hunger stir in her that she had long ago learned to suppress. "His Grace won't mind if you borrow a few," Lucy said, watching Elena's face with evident amusement. "In fact, I think he'd be pleased. Not many folks around here share his love of books. Most find this room a bit much, if I'm honest, but you look like you could stay here all day." Elena laughed softly, surprised by how easily the sound came, how unguarded she felt in this quiet, book-filled room. "I could indeed. My stepmother never allowed much reading in her house. She considered it a waste of time, better spent on more practical pursuits." "Well," Lucy said, with the confidence of someone secure in her place within this household, "you're not in your stepmother's house now." The words settled over Elena with unexpected weight. She was not, indeed, in Margaret's house any longer, not for the moment at least. And something about standing in this vast, quiet library, surrounded by books she was actually permitted to read, made the distance between her old life and this strange new circumstance feel suddenly very real. As the day wore on, Elena found herself drawn back to the library, again and again, losing herself in books she had never been allowed to touch before, while around her the quiet rhythms of Ashcombe Hall continued undisturbed. She caught occasional glimpses of the Duke moving between meetings with his steward and correspondence at his desk, always polite when their paths crossed, always careful to ask after her comfort, though he seemed equally content to leave her to her own devices when she preferred solitude. It was strange, she reflected that evening, sitting once again by the fire in her guest room, how quickly a place could begin to feel less like a stranger's house, and more like something almost like shelter. She thought of Margaret, likely furious by now that no word had come confirming Elena's humiliation, likely already planning some new cruelty to compensate for whatever satisfaction she had been denied. But for tonight at least, Elena allowed herself to simply exist in this unexpected pocket of peace, unaware of how quickly that peace would be tested by the return of a woman who did not take kindly to having her carefully constructed cruelty undone. 3 days passed before Elena began to notice the true shape of the man who had offered her a chair without a single word of judgment. She had expected, at first, that his kindness might be a passing courtesy, the sort of politeness a gentleman extends to any guest regardless of circumstance, something that would fade once the novelty of her arrival wore off. Instead, she found the opposite. The longer she remained at Ashcombe Hall, the more she began to see the quiet, careful ways the Duke moved through his own life, ways that had nothing to do with impressing a guest, and everything to do with who he simply was when he believed no one of consequence was watching. She saw it first with the Hartley family, tenants who worked a modest farm at the edge of the estate. Elena had been walking the grounds with Lucy when they passed a small cottage where a woman stood in the doorway, clearly exhausted, 3 young children clinging to her skirts, while she spoke with quiet desperation to a man who had arrived on horseback. Elena recognized the rider a moment later as the Duke himself, dressed plainly, without any of the formal trappings she had grown to associate with him. "That's Mrs. Hartley," Lucy explained quietly, as they paused a respectful distance away. "Her husband took ill last winter, and hasn't been able to work the fields proper since. Most landlords would have turned them out by now, for falling behind on their portion of the harvest." "And the Duke has not?" Elena asked, watching as Alistair dismounted, and spoke to the woman in a tone too low to carry across the distance, though his posture suggested patience rather than the stern accounting she might have expected. "Quite the opposite," Lucy said. "He's had their portion covered from his own accounts these past 2 seasons, and told them not to breathe a word of it to the other tenants, lest they feel obligated to make a fuss about his generosity. I only know because I overheard him instructing his steward, and I've kept it to myself since, same as he asked." Elena watched as the Duke crouched down to speak with one of the Hartley children, a small boy who had wandered close to inspect the horse, and something in the easy, unguarded warmth of that moment struck her deeply. This was not a performance meant for an audience. This was simply who the man was, quietly and consistently, in moments when he believed himself unobserved. Later that same week, Elena witnessed another side of him entirely, one that revealed itself by accident rather than intention. She had gone looking for a particular book in the library, only to find the room empty, except for the Duke himself, seated not at his usual desk, but in a chair near the window, an old and worn photograph held in his hands, his expression distant in a way she had not seen before. She nearly withdrew, sensing she had intruded on something private, but he looked up before she could retreat, and something in his face told her it was too late to pretend she had seen nothing. "I did not mean to disturb you," she said quietly. "I can return later." "You are not disturbing me," he said, though his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before. He glanced down at the photograph again, then set it aside on the small table beside his chair, as though needing a moment to compose himself before speaking further. "Today would have been my brother's birthday. He passed some years ago now, but I confess the day never grows entirely easier." Elena stood still, uncertain whether to offer sympathy or simply retreat and leave him to his private grief. But something in his openness, however brief, made her want to stay, to acknowledge what he had shared, rather than pretend she had not noticed. "I am sorry," she said simply. "Losing someone does not become easier with time, only different, I think. The missing simply learns to sit in a new shape." The Duke looked at her with something like surprise, as though he had not expected such understanding from a young woman he had known only a few days. "You speak as someone with experience in such matters." "My mother," Elena said quietly. "I was young when she passed, but I remember enough of her to still feel the absence, even years later. And my father, more recently, though our relationship in his final years was complicated by matters outside his control." "Complicated how?" the Duke asked, his tone gentle, careful not to press too hard, though genuinely curious. Elena hesitated, unused to being asked about her own history with any real interest. "My father remarried after my mother's death, and I believe he cared for Margaret, at least in the beginning. But he grew increasingly absent from his own household in his final years, whether from illness or simply from avoiding the tension between myself and my stepmother. I could never entirely say. By the time he passed, I had already learned to expect very little comfort from that house." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his sharp eyes studying her with an expression that held no pity, only a kind of careful attention that made Elena feel, oddly, less alone in the telling of it. "It seems," he said finally, "that we have both learned to carry certain absences quietly, without expecting much comfort from those around us. Is that why you keep so much to yourself?" Elena asked, emboldened by the strange intimacy of the moment. "The staff speak of you as reclusive, though I confess, I have found very little truth in the coldness people attribute to you." Something flickered across the Duke's expression, a brief hesitation before he answered. "After my brother's passing, and certain other difficulties in my family that I will not burden you with today, I found it simpler to keep my circle small. Fewer people to disappoint, fewer people whose absence might one day need to be carried. It is not coldness, precisely, though I understand why it might appear that way from the outside." Elena thought of her own careful habits, the way she had learned to make herself small and unremarkable within Margaret's household, to avoid drawing attention that so often turned to cruelty. She recognized something of herself in the Duke's careful distance, though his circumstances and hers were vastly different in scale and comfort. "I understand that instinct," she said quietly, "though I confess, since arriving here, I have found myself wondering whether keeping so carefully small and quiet has cost me more than it has protected me." The Duke's gaze sharpened slightly at that. as though her words had struck closer to some private thought of his own than she realized. "What do you mean?" Elena considered how to answer, aware she was treading into territory she had never shared with anyone. "In my stepmother's house, I learned early that drawing notice, having opinions, expressing wants of my own, only ever invited punishment or ridicule. So I learned to want very little, to expect very little, to simply exist quietly enough that I might avoid the worst of her attention. But since arriving here, being offered a chair, a room, a library full of books I am actually permitted to read, I find myself remembering what it feels like to want things again, and I am not entirely certain what to do with that feeling." The Duke was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a gentleness Elena had not heard from him before, softer even than the careful courtesy he had shown since her arrival. "Then perhaps," he said, "while you remain under this roof, you might allow yourself to practice wanting things again, in small and manageable ways. A book you wish to read, a meal you would prefer over another, an opinion you would like heard, rather than silenced. There is no punishment waiting here for such small acts of wanting, Miss Whitmore. I give you my word on that." Elena felt something loosen in her chest at his words, some tightly wound thing she had carried for so long she had nearly forgotten its weight. "That is a strange kind of gift to offer someone," she said softly. "Permission to want things." "Perhaps," the Duke agreed. "But I suspect it is one you have not been given nearly often enough." From that day forward, small things began to shift within the quiet rhythm of Ashcombe Hall. Elena found herself, hesitantly at first, expressing preferences she would never have dared voice in Margaret's house. A request for a particular book from the library, a quiet admission that she preferred the garden's eastern paths, where the roses grew thickest, a small opinion, offered during dinner conversation, about a matter of local news the Duke had raised. Each time, rather than the punishment or ridicule she still half expected out of long habit, she was met only with genuine interest, a nod of acknowledgement, sometimes even a thoughtful question in return. The Duke, for his part, seemed to notice these small shifts in her with quiet attention, never drawing overt attention to them, never making her feel observed or studied, but simply making space for them to continue, meal after meal, day after day, in a manner that felt less like charity and more like the slow, careful rebuilding of something Elena had not realized was broken until she began to feel its pieces settling back into place. Neither of them spoke yet of what this growing ease between them might mean, nor of how long Elena might reasonably remain a guest in a household not her own. But something had shifted in the space between them, subtle and quiet, the kind of change that neither fully understood yet, but that both, in their own careful and guarded ways, had begun to notice. News of Elena's presence at Ashcombe Hall did not remain private for long, no matter how carefully the household staff had been instructed to keep the matter quiet. It was Lucy who brought word one morning, her face troubled as she helped Elena arrange her hair before breakfast. "There's talk in the village," Lucy admitted reluctantly, when Elena pressed her on what had put such a worried crease between her eyebrows. "Someone from the kitchen staff mentioned your arrival to a cousin who works in town, and now half the county seems to know a young lady has been staying at Ashcombe Hall these past 2 weeks. Folks are asking questions about who you are, and why His Grace has taken such an interest in your welfare." Elena's stomach tightened at the news. She had grown so accustomed to the quiet safety of the estate that she had nearly forgotten the wider world existed beyond its gates, a world that included Margaret and her particular talent for turning any piece of gossip into a weapon. "Does the Duke know?" she asked. "He does," Lucy confirmed. "And from what I hear, he's decided the best response to gossip is not to hide from it, but to face it directly. There's to be a dinner this coming week, a proper social gathering with some of the neighboring families, and you're to be included as a guest, plain and simple, rather than some secret kept behind closed doors." Elena felt a flutter of nerves at the thought. She had never attended a proper social dinner in her life, not as an honored guest at least, and the idea of facing a room full of curious strangers, all of them wondering exactly what her relationship to the Duke might be, filled her with a dread she had not felt since her first night at the estate's gates. The evening of the dinner arrived faster than Elena would have liked. Lucy helped her into a gown the Duke had quietly arranged to be made for her, a deep blue silk that fit her properly for the first time in longer than she could remember, and though Elena felt strange and unfamiliar in her own reflection, she also felt, for the first time, genuinely presentable rather than merely tolerated. The dining hall, usually so quiet and still, buzzed with conversation and candlelight by the time the guests arrived. Elena recognized none of the faces among the local gentry, though she felt their eyes upon her the moment she entered the room at the Duke's side, curiosity and speculation evident in every glance exchanged between the guests. Among the arrivals was a tall, confident man introduced to her as Lord Edmund Blackwood, a neighboring landowner whose polished manners could not quite disguise the calculating look in his eyes as he assessed Elena from across the room. "Miss Whitmore," Blackwood said smoothly, once introductions had been properly made. "I confess, I have heard a great deal about your rather unusual arrival at Ashcombe Hall. A prank gone wrong, was it not? How very dramatic." Elena felt her face warm at the public reference to her humiliation, but before she could formulate a response, the Duke's voice cut in beside her, calm, but unmistakably firm. "Miss Whitmore arrived under circumstances orchestrated by a family member with poor judgment," the Duke said, his tone leaving no room for the mockery Blackwood had clearly hoped to provoke. "I would not describe her circumstances as dramatic, so much as unfortunate, and I trust my guests to extend her the same courtesy they would extend any other member of this household." Blackwood's smile faltered slightly at the clear rebuke embedded in the Duke's words, though he recovered quickly, inclining his head in acknowledgement. "Of course, Your Grace. No offense intended toward the lady." Throughout the remainder of the dinner, Elena noticed the Duke's quiet attention never straying far from her comfort, even as he engaged in conversation with his other guests. When a particularly pointed question arose about her family background, he smoothly redirected the conversation before she was forced to explain circumstances she preferred to keep private. When Blackwood attempted another veiled jab about her unusual arrival, disguised as polite curiosity, the Duke's response was measured but unmistakably protective, closing off the line of questioning with quiet authority that left no room for further probing. Later in the evening, as the guests mingled in the drawing room following dinner, Elena found herself briefly alone with Blackwood near the fireplace, the Duke having stepped away to attend to another guest's request. "You are a curious mystery, Miss Whitmore," Blackwood said, his voice lower now, more probing. "A young woman of no particular fortune or family connection, suddenly residing at Ashcombe Hall, under the personal protection of a Duke known throughout the county for his reluctance to entertain guests of any kind. One does wonder what precisely has earned you such unusual favor." The implication in his tone was unmistakable, and Elena felt a flash of anger rise in her chest, sharper and more immediate than the fear she might have felt in Margaret's house under similar provocation. She had spent years learning to swallow such insinuations quietly, but something about the safety of the past 2 weeks had begun to change what she was willing to accept without protest. "My circumstances are my own business, Lord Blackwood," she said, her voice steadier than she expected, "and I would ask that you not speculate on matters you know nothing about." Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly at her unexpected firmness, clearly not having anticipated such a direct response from a young woman he had assumed would shrink from his provocation. Before he could respond further, the Duke returned to Elena's side, his presence alone seeming to shift the entire tenor of the conversation. "Blackwood," the Duke said evenly, "I believe Lady Ashford was hoping to discuss the matter of the new bridge with you. She mentioned your family's opinion carries particular weight on such infrastructure matters." It was a clear dismissal, however politely phrased, and Blackwood, recognizing it as such, offered a stiff bow before moving away to seek out Lady Ashford across the room. "I apologize for his behavior," the Duke said quietly once they were alone. "Blackwood has never learned the value of discretion, nor the boundaries of polite curiosity." "You need not apologize on his behalf," Elena said, though she appreciated the gesture. "I have grown accustomed to defending myself against such insinuations." "You should not have to," the Duke said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity that surprised her. "Not here, and not while under my protection." Elena looked up at him, struck by the phrase he had chosen, "under my protection," and the weight it seemed to carry beyond mere hospitality. She did not know quite what to make of the warmth that had begun to grow between them over these past 2 weeks, nor whether it was appropriate to name it as anything beyond simple gratitude for his continued kindness. "You have done more for me in 2 weeks than my own family managed in 3 years, she said quietly. "I am not certain how I will ever properly repay such kindness." The Duke's expression softened, something in his sharp, guarded eyes loosening slightly as he looked at her. I do not offer kindness expecting repayment, Miss Whitmore. I offer it because it is deserved, and because I find, increasingly, that your company has become rather important to me these past weeks. The admission hung between them, quiet but significant, and Elena felt her heart quicken at words she had not expected to hear, not from a man of his position, not directed at someone of her circumstances. Before either of them could say more, however, the sound of raised voices from the entrance hall interrupted the moment, and Mr. Whitfield appeared in the doorway of the drawing room, his composed expression cracked with unmistakable alarm. "Your Grace," he said, his voice carrying just enough urgency to draw the attention of nearby guests. "Forgive the interruption, but there is a woman at the front gate demanding entry, claiming she has come to collect her stepdaughter." Elena's blood ran cold. She did not need to ask who the woman was. Margaret had finally come, and whatever fragile peace Elena had begun to build within the walls of Ashcombe Hall was about to face its first true test. The drawing room fell into an uneasy hush as the assembled guests exchanged whispered speculation, and Elena felt every eye in the room turn toward her, curiosity now edged with something sharper, something that smelled of scandal in the making. The Duke, however, showed no trace of the alarm rippling through his guests. He simply turned to Mr. Whitfield with the same measured calm he had shown from the very first moment Elena had arrived at his gates. "Show her to my study," the Duke instructed, "not the drawing room. I will not have my other guests subjected to whatever performance she has planned for this evening." Mr. Whitfield nodded and disappeared to carry out the instruction, while the Duke turned back to Elena, his expression gentling slightly as he took in the tension visible in her shoulders, the way her hands had curled into her skirts. "You do not have to face her tonight, if you would prefer not to," he said quietly. "I can speak with her myself and settle the matter without requiring your presence." Elena considered the offer for a moment, tempted by the thought of avoiding Margaret's presence entirely. But she thought of the years she had spent shrinking from confrontation, swallowing her voice to avoid provoking worse treatment, and something in her rebelled against the idea of hiding now, in a house where she had finally begun to remember what it felt like to be treated with basic dignity. "No," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I will face her. I would rather hear whatever she has to say directly than wonder about it later." The Duke studied her for a moment, something like quiet approval flickering across his expression, before he offered his arm. "Then we will face her together." They made their way to the study, leaving the curious guests behind in the drawing room, where Elena suspected the whispered speculation would only grow more elaborate in their absence. The study itself was smaller than the grand hall, where Elena had first been offered a chair, but no less imposing, lined with dark wood shelves and lit by the warm glow of a single lamp on the Duke's desk. Margaret was already waiting when they arrived, having been shown in by a visibly uncomfortable Mr. Whitfield, and she turned toward the door the moment it opened, her expression shifting rapidly from irritation to a carefully practiced smile the instant she registered the Duke's presence at Elena's side. "Your Grace," Margaret said, dropping into a curtsy far more elaborate than the occasion warranted, "I do apologize for the lateness of the hour and the manner of my arrival. I have come only out of a mother's concern, having heard the most alarming rumors that my stepdaughter has been residing here for some weeks now, without proper chaperone or family oversight." Elena watched her stepmother's performance with a strange, detached clarity, noticing for the first time how transparent the manipulation appeared when observed from a place of safety rather than fear. Margaret's concern was a costume, put on for the Duke's benefit, nothing more. "Your concern is somewhat curious," the Duke replied, his voice pleasant, but carrying an edge Elena had come to recognize as dangerous beneath its calm surface. "Given that it was you who sent Elena to my gates in the first place, dressed for humiliation, carrying a letter designed to mock her before a stranger, with no consideration for what might happen to her along a dark road at night." Margaret's composure flickered, just barely, before she recovered with practiced smoothness. "A harmless jest, Your Grace, nothing more. Young women require a certain toughening if they are to survive in this world, and I confess, I never imagined Elena would be foolish enough to actually present herself at your gates, rather than simply returning home once she realized the situation. You imagined she would walk several miles home alone, in the dark, in humiliation, rather than seek shelter," the Duke said, his voice hardening further. "That is not a harmless jest, Mrs. Whitmore. That is negligence, dressed up as discipline." Margaret's smile tightened at the corners, though she pressed on, changing tactics. "Regardless of how the matter began, Your Grace, it is not proper for an unmarried young woman to remain under the roof of an unmarried gentleman for weeks on end, whatever the circumstances. I have come to bring her home, where she belongs, before further damage is done to her reputation, and indeed to yours." Elena felt the old fear rising in her chest at Margaret's words, the familiar instinct to comply, to avoid conflict, to make herself smaller in the face of her stepmother's authority. But she thought of the chair offered without judgment, the library full of books she had finally been permitted to read, the quiet, steady kindness she had found within these walls, and she found her voice before the Duke could respond on her behalf. "You did not come out of concern for my reputation," Elena said, and though her voice shook slightly, it did not waver. "You came because you heard I was being treated with kindness, rather than suffering the humiliation you intended, and that outcome did not sit well with you." Margaret's eyes narrowed at Elena's unexpected defiance, some of the practiced sweetness draining from her expression. "You would do well to remember your place, Elena. Whatever comforts you have enjoyed here these past weeks, they are temporary, and you will still require a home to return to once His Grace tires of playing host to his little charity case." The word charity case landed like a slap, and Elena felt her face flush, old shame threatening to rise up and silence her, the way it always had before. But before she could respond, the Duke stepped forward, his presence filling the room with quiet, unmistakable authority. "Miss Whitmore is not a charity case in this household, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice low and controlled, but carrying a weight that made even Margaret's confidence falter. "She is a guest, treated with the respect and dignity that should have been afforded to her in your own home, and frankly was not. I would ask you to reconsider your tone before you continue this conversation." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but the Duke continued before she could speak, his tone growing colder with each word. "I have looked into your household's finances since Elena's arrival here, Mrs. Whitmore. It seems her father left a modest inheritance intended for her benefit upon reaching her majority, an inheritance that has, curiously, been managed entirely by you these past 3 years, with very little of it finding its way toward Elena's actual welfare." Elena's breath caught. She had known, vaguely, that her father left something behind, but Margaret had always insisted the estate had been consumed by debts, that nothing remained for Elena to claim. Hearing the Duke speak of an inheritance she had never known still existed sent a jolt of shock through her. Margaret's face had gone pale, the practiced sweetness entirely abandoned now, in favor of something sharper, more defensive. "That inheritance has been managed responsibly, invested for her future benefit, precisely as her father intended." "Then you will not object," the Duke said evenly, "to a full accounting of that inheritance being reviewed by my own solicitor, a Mr. Colton, whom I have already engaged to look into the matter. I imagine such a review would put to rest any concerns either of us might have about Elena's proper welfare going forward." The silence that followed stretched long and uncomfortable, and Elena watched her stepmother's carefully constructed composure crack fully for the first time, revealing something far more calculating and far less concerned with propriety than the performance she had arrived with. "This is not your concern, Your Grace," Margaret said finally, her voice tight with barely restrained anger. "Elena is my responsibility, and I will not have an outsider interfering in family matters that do not concern him. Elena's welfare became my concern the moment you sent her to my gates, as a cruel joke, without regard for her safety," the Duke replied. "And I intend to see that concern through to its proper conclusion, whether that satisfies you or not." Margaret's gaze shifted to Elena, sharp and calculating, searching perhaps for some sign of the fear and compliance she had always been able to count on in the past. But Elena, standing in the warm lamplight of the Duke's study, surrounded by a kindness she had never known before arriving at these gates, found she no longer had to search for the courage to meet her stepmother's gaze, evenly, without flinching. "I will not be returning home with you tonight," Elena said quietly, but with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "Nor, I suspect, at any point in the near future." Margaret's mouth tightened into a thin, furious line, but whatever response she might have made was interrupted by Mr. Whitfield's quiet reappearance at the study door. informing them that Margaret's carriage driver had grown impatient waiting in the cold and was asking after her departure. The moment broken, Margaret gathered what remained of her composure and offered a stiff, insincere farewell before departing, though the look she cast back at Elena as she left promised this confrontation was far from finished. Once the door closed behind her, Elena let out a long breath she had not realized she was holding, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. The Duke's hand found her elbow, steadying her gently, his expression soft with concern. "You did well," he said quietly. "Better than well." That took considerable courage. "I have never spoken to her that way before," Elena admitted, still slightly stunned by her own defiance. "I did not know I had it in me." "I suspect," the Duke said gently, "you have always had it in you. You simply were never given the safety to let it surface until now." Elena looked up at him, grateful and shaken in equal measure, aware that whatever peace this small victory had won them tonight, Margaret was not a woman who would let the matter rest quietly. And the inheritance the Duke had mentioned, an inheritance Elena had known nothing about until this very evening, promised to complicate matters further before they were finally resolved. Mr. Colton arrived at Ashcombe Hall 3 days after Margaret's confrontation in the study. A small, precise man, with wire spectacles and a leather satchel full of documents he had spent the better part of a week gathering from the county records office. Elena sat across from him in the Duke's study, her hands folded tightly in her lap, while the solicitor laid out papers across the desk with careful, methodical movements. "Your father's will was quite clear, Miss Whitmore," Mr. Colton began, adjusting his spectacles as he studied the documents before him. "Upon his passing, he left a sum of £800, specifically designated for your benefit, to be held in trust and released to you upon your 21st birthday, or upon your marriage, whichever came first." Elena felt her breath catch. £800 was more money than she had ever imagined possessing in her life, certainly more than Margaret had ever suggested existed within her father's modest estate. "I was told there was nothing left, that his debts had consumed whatever remained." That was evidently not entirely true, Mr. Colton said, his tone carefully neutral, though Elena caught the flicker of disapproval beneath his professional composure. "Your father's estate did carry some debts, yes, but nowhere near enough to consume the full trust left in your name. According to these records, your stepmother, acting as trustee, has drawn against that sum steadily over the past 3 years, citing various expenses related to your care and upbringing." "What expenses?" Elena asked, though she already suspected the answer would reveal little more than another layer of Margaret's careful deception. Mr. Colton flipped through several pages, his frown deepening as he read. "Household expenses, primarily. Clothing purchases that, from the dates and amounts listed, appear to correspond far more closely with items purchased for her own daughters than for yourself. Tutoring fees, for lessons you do not appear to have received. A rather significant sum listed simply as miscellaneous care, with no further itemization provided." Elena sat in stunned silence, absorbing the full weight of what she was hearing. Margaret had not simply neglected her out of coldness or favoritism toward her own daughters. She had been actively draining an inheritance meant for Elena's benefit, funneling those funds toward Clara and Beatrice's comfort, while dressing Elena in cast-off scraps and treating her as an unwanted burden within her own father's house. "How much remains?" the Duke asked quietly, watching Elena's face with evident concern as she processed the revelation. Mr. Colton consulted his figures once more. "By my calculations, approximately £340 remains of the original 800, assuming no further withdrawals have been made since these most recent records. Given that Miss Whitmore's 21st birthday falls within the coming year, according to the parish records I reviewed, the trust would have been due to transfer to her regardless, making this an opportune time to formalize a proper accounting before further funds are depleted." Elena felt a strange mixture of anger and vindication settle over her. Anger at the years of deprivation she had endured, while funds meant for her own care were quietly diverted elsewhere, but also a fierce, unexpected relief at finally having proof, real and undeniable, that her years of suffering under Margaret's roof had not been the result of genuine poverty, but of deliberate, calculated theft. "What can be done?" she asked, looking between the solicitor and the Duke. "A formal petition can be filed with the county magistrate," Mr. Colton explained, "requesting an immediate accounting of the trust and a transfer of remaining funds directly into your control, given your approaching majority. Given the clear irregularities in these records, I do not anticipate significant difficulty in securing a favorable ruling, though your stepmother will likely contest the matter, if only to avoid the embarrassment of a public accounting of her mismanagement. The Duke, who had remained quiet through much of the solicitor's explanation, spoke up then, his voice carrying the same quiet authority Elena had come to associate with his presence. I will cover whatever legal costs are required to see this matter through properly, Mr. Colton. Miss Whitmore should not have to bear any further burden in reclaiming what was rightfully hers from the start. That is not necessary, Elena began, but the Duke shook his head gently. It is necessary, he said. Not as charity, but as simple justice. You have spent 3 years enduring hardship that was entirely avoidable, funded by resources that belonged to you all along. The least this household can do is ensure you are not further burdened in reclaiming what is rightfully yours. Mr. Colton gathered his papers and departed shortly after, promising to file the necessary petition within the week, leaving Elena alone with the Duke in the quiet study, the weight of the afternoon's revelations still settling heavily over her. I do not know how to feel, Elena admitted quietly, staring at the space on the desk where the documents had lain moments before. Angry, certainly, but also strangely relieved, as though some part of me always suspected the truth was worse than what Margaret told me, and now I finally have proof, rather than simply a feeling I could never quite articulate. Both feelings are reasonable, the Duke said gently, moving to sit in the chair beside hers, rather than remaining behind his desk. You are allowed to feel angry about years of deprivation you did not deserve, and relieved to finally have clarity, after so long living with uncertainty. Neither feeling cancels out the other. Elena looked at him, grateful once again for the way he seemed to understand her without requiring lengthy explanation, the way he had understood so much about her circumstances from the very first night she arrived at his gates. Margaret will not accept this quietly. You said as much yourself. No, the Duke agreed. I do not imagine she will, but you are no longer facing her alone, Elena, and I do not intend to let her intimidation tactics succeed a second time. It was the first time he had used her given name, rather than the more formal address he had maintained since her arrival, and Elena felt the small shift land with unexpected weight, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had traveled together in these past weeks, from stranger and unexpected guest to something that had begun to feel, cautiously and carefully, like genuine partnership. Thank you, she said softly, for all of this, for the solicitor, for standing beside me tonight, for everything you have done since that first evening at your gates. The Duke reached over and took her hand gently in his, a small gesture, but one that carried significant weight, given how careful and measured he had been in all his interactions with her thus far. I have not done these things purely out of obligation, Elena, nor simply out of a sense of justice, though both certainly play their part. I have come, over these past weeks, to care for you a great deal, and I find I want to see you safe and properly provided for, not because it is the right thing to do, though it is, but because your welfare has become important to me in ways I did not entirely anticipate when you first arrived at my gates. Elena's heart quickened at his words, at the warmth in his voice, at the careful, deliberate way he had chosen to share something she suspected he did not offer easily or often. I feel the same, she admitted quietly, though I confess I have been afraid to name it, given how quickly and strangely all of this has unfolded. We need not rush to name anything before we are ready, the Duke said gently. There is time yet to see this matter with your stepmother resolved properly, and time for whatever exists between us to grow at its own pace, without pressure or expectation. Elena nodded, grateful for his patience, though something in her chest had loosened at his admission, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth beside them. Whatever challenges Margaret still intended to bring, whatever battles remained to secure Elena's rightful inheritance and independence, she found herself facing them now with something she had not possessed before arriving at Ashcombe Hall, genuine hope, and the quiet, steadying presence of someone who had chosen, from the very first moment, to offer her dignity rather than judgment. The petition Mr. Colton filed with the county magistrate proceeded faster than Elena had expected, though not without the complications the Duke had warned her to anticipate. Word arrived within a fortnight that Margaret intended to contest the accounting entirely, retaining a solicitor of her own, and preparing to argue before the magistrate that all funds drawn from the trust had been spent legitimately on Elena's care, regardless of what the records appeared to suggest. The hearing was set to take place in the county courthouse, a modest stone building in the nearby town that Elena had passed many times in her life without ever imagining she would one day stand within its walls to reclaim what had been stolen from her. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple, dignified gown Lucy had helped her select, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the final buttons. "You look ready to face anything," Lucy said encouragingly, adjusting a stray curl near Elena's temple. "And you have His Grace and Mr. Colton both standing with you. Whatever your stepmother tries today, she won't be facing you alone this time." Elena appreciated the reassurance, though nervousness still churned in her stomach as the carriage carried her, the Duke, and Mr. Colton toward the courthouse. The Duke sat across from her, his expression calm but attentive, occasionally offering quiet words of encouragement as the modest town came into view through the carriage window. "Whatever occurs today," he said as the courthouse steps came into sight, "know that the outcome does not change what I know to be true about your character, nor what this household has come to feel about your place within it." Elena managed a small, grateful smile, though her attention was quickly drawn to the sight of Margaret already standing near the courthouse entrance, flanked by a stern-faced solicitor and, to Elena's surprise, Lord Edmund Blackwood, who stood close beside her stepmother with an expression of practiced sympathy that struck Elena as entirely false. "What is he doing here?" Elena murmured to the Duke as they approached. The Duke's jaw tightened slightly, though his expression remained composed. "I suspect Blackwood has found common cause with your stepmother, given his own evident interest in acquiring whatever fortune might come attached to a young woman he considers suitably desperate for his attention. It seems today we will discover the full extent of that alliance." Inside the courthouse, the hearing proceeded with a formality Elena found both intimidating and strangely clarifying. The magistrate, a stern older man, who listened to each side's arguments with careful, measured attention. Margaret's solicitor argued at length that all withdrawn funds had been spent appropriately on Elena's upbringing, presenting a set of receipts that Mr. Colton quickly identified as containing significant discrepancies when compared against the original trust documentation. When it came time for Elena herself to speak, her voice shook only slightly as she described the years of mismatched clothing, the absent tutoring lessons Margaret claimed to have funded, the general pattern of neglect that stood in stark contrast to the sums supposedly spent on her care. She spoke of the prank that had sent her to the Duke's gates, the letter meant to humiliate her, the utter disregard for her safety that had characterized her stepmother's treatment of her for years. Margaret, watching from across the room, grew visibly agitated as Elena's testimony continued, occasionally exchanging tense whispers with her solicitor, though she said nothing to interrupt the proceedings directly. It was only when the magistrate turned to address Blackwood, curious about his presence and apparent connection to the matter, that the true shape of the alliance between Margaret and the young lord finally came to light. "Lord Blackwood," the magistrate said, "you are not named in these proceedings. Yet you appear alongside Mrs. Whitmore today. What is your interest in this matter?" Blackwood shifted uncomfortably, clearly not having anticipated being drawn so directly into the proceedings. "I have merely offered Mrs. Whitmore my support during a difficult family matter, Your Honor, nothing more." But Mr. Colton, sensing an opportunity, rose to address the magistrate. "If I may, Your Honor, I have reason to believe Lord Blackwood's interest extends beyond mere neighborly support. I have obtained correspondence suggesting Lord Blackwood proposed an arrangement to Mrs. Whitmore some weeks ago, in which he would pursue marriage to Miss Whitmore once her inheritance was secured, with an understanding that a portion of that inheritance would subsequently benefit Mrs. Whitmore in exchange for her cooperation in arranging the match." A murmur rippled through the courtroom at this revelation, and Elena felt a fresh wave of shock wash over her as the full extent of the scheme became clear. Margaret had not simply been draining her inheritance quietly. She had been actively planning to marry Elena off to Blackwood the moment the funds became accessible, ensuring she would continue to profit from Elena's fortune, even after formally relinquishing control of the trust. Margaret's composure finally cracked entirely under the weight of this exposure, her face flushing with a mixture of anger and humiliation, as the magistrate turned toward her with evident disapproval. Blackwood, for his part, attempted to distance himself from the arrangement, insisting the correspondence had been merely exploratory, though the damage to his reputation within the courtroom was already done. The magistrate, after reviewing the full accounting presented by Mr. Colton and hearing the testimony regarding the proposed marriage arrangement, ruled decisively in Elena's favor. The remaining funds from her father's trust, along with an additional sum representing the improperly withdrawn amounts, were ordered transferred immediately into Elena's own control, with Margaret barred from any further access to or claim upon the inheritance. As the hearing concluded and the small crowd began to disperse, Margaret approached Elena one final time, her earlier composure entirely abandoned in favor of raw, undisguised bitterness. "You think this changes anything?" Margaret hissed quietly, careful to keep her voice low enough to avoid the magistrate's notice. "You think a duke's protection will last forever? That this newfound fortune will buy you the kind of life you imagine for yourself? You will always be the girl I raised out of pity, Elena, regardless of how much money now sits in your name." Elena looked at her stepmother, and for the first time in her life, she felt nothing but a calm, quiet clarity in response to words that once would have devastated her. "You did not raise me out of pity, Margaret. You raised me as a source of funds to be quietly drained while you lavished attention on your own daughters. I see that clearly now, and I no longer need your approval or your version of events to understand my own worth." Margaret's mouth opened as though to respond, but no words came, and after a long, tense moment, she turned and walked away without another word, Blackwood trailing awkwardly behind her, his own reputation now thoroughly tarnished by the day's revelations. The Duke appeared at Elena's side as Margaret's carriage pulled away from the courthouse, his expression a careful mixture of relief and quiet pride. "You handled that with more grace than she deserved," he said softly. "I do not feel entirely graceful," Elena admitted, still slightly shaken by the confrontation. "Mostly, I feel exhausted, and strangely lighter, as though a weight I had carried for years has finally been set down." "That is graceful enough," the Duke said, offering his arm as they made their way back toward the waiting carriage. "The important matter now is not what Margaret believes about your worth, but what you are finally free to build for yourself, unburdened by her control or her schemes." Elena took his arm, feeling the truth of his words settle over her as they walked away from the courthouse and toward whatever future now waited for her, finally free of the inheritance that had been stolen and the stepmother who had never valued her beyond the funds she represented. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the future ahead of her felt genuinely her own to shape, rather than something dictated entirely by the cruelty of others. In the weeks following the hearing, Elena found herself in a position she had never once imagined possible for herself, genuinely free to choose her own path, unburdened by financial dependence on anyone, with a modest but real fortune settled securely in her own name. Mr. Colton had helped her establish proper accounts, and for the first time in her life, Elena possessed the means to support herself independently, should she choose to leave Ashcombe Hall and build a life entirely of her own making. It was this newfound freedom that the Duke raised one quiet afternoon, as they walked together through the gardens, the roses Elena had grown fond of, blooming fully now in the warmth of the changing season. "You are no longer obligated to remain here," the Duke said, choosing his words with evident care. "With your inheritance secured, you have options now that did not exist for you before. You could establish your own household, however modest, or seek out relations in other parts of the country, or simply build whatever life appeals to you, entirely free of any expectation tied to your circumstances here." Elena stopped walking, studying his expression carefully, trying to read what lay beneath the careful, measured tone of his words. "Are you asking me to leave?" "No," the Duke said quickly, something almost like alarm crossing his features at the suggestion. "Quite the opposite, if I am honest. I only wish to be certain that whatever you choose going forward, you choose it freely, not out of any sense of obligation toward this household, nor out of fear that you have nowhere else to go. You have somewhere else to go now, Elena. That much has changed, and I would not have you stay here simply because leaving feels unfamiliar." Elena considered his words carefully, understanding the gift he was offering her, however awkwardly phrased. For years, every choice available to her had been dictated by necessity, by fear, by the absence of any real alternative. Now, standing in the quiet garden of Ashcombe Hall, she found herself facing something she had rarely experienced in her life. A genuine, unforced choice, made not out of desperation, but out of preference. I have thought about it, she admitted. About what it would mean to build an independent life somewhere else. Away from all of this. Away from the memories of Margaret, and the years I spent under her roof. And what have you concluded? The Duke asked, his voice carefully neutral, though Elena could sense the tension beneath his composure. That, I do not wish to leave, she said simply. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I have found something here I do not wish to give up. Not merely the comfort of this house, or the safety it has provided me these past weeks, but you, specifically. The way you offered me a chair before you knew a single thing about me. The way you have treated my dignity as something worth protecting. Long before I had any fortune to my name, that might have made such protection convenient. The Duke's expression softened entirely at her words, the careful reserve he had maintained even through this conversation, finally giving way to something warmer, more open than Elena had seen from him before. I had hoped, though I did not wish to presume, that this might be your answer. What did you hope for precisely? Elena asked, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the seriousness of the moment. That you might choose to remain here, not as a guest, nor as a charitable ward, whose circumstances happen to require my assistance, but as something far more permanent, the Duke said, taking her hands gently in his own. Elena, I have come to care for you more deeply than I have cared for anyone since my brother's passing. More deeply, if I am honest, than I believed myself capable of caring for anyone again. I would ask you to consider remaining here as my wife, if such a future would bring you genuine happiness, rather than mere security. Elena felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice, the careful vulnerability of a man who had spent years guarding himself against further loss, now offering her something he clearly did not offer easily or often. I would like that very much, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Though I confess, given how our acquaintance began, with a prank meant to humiliate rather than a proper introduction, I imagine we will have quite a story to tell in years to come. The Duke laughed softly at that, a genuine, unguarded sound Elena had rarely heard from him, and the warmth of it settled over her like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long winter. Indeed we shall. Though I confess I would not change a single moment of how it unfolded, difficult as those first hours were for you. Had your stepmother not sent you to my gates that night, I might never have discovered how much your presence would come to matter to this house, and to me. They remained in the garden a while longer, discussing quietly the shape their future might take, the practical matters of an engagement between a duke and a young woman whose circumstances had shifted so dramatically in these past months. There would be gossip, certainly, given the unusual nature of their introduction, but Elena found she cared far less about such gossip than she once might have, secure now in both her own worth and the genuine affection of the man who had chosen her not for her fortune, which had not even existed when their acquaintance began, but for who she was underneath the mismatched dress and the exhausted, frightened young woman who had first stepped into his grand entrance hall. News of the engagement spread quickly through the county in the following weeks, and while some gossip inevitably circulated regarding the unusual circumstances of their meeting, the overall response proved warmer than Elena had anticipated. Neighbors who had once regarded the Duke as distant and unreachable found themselves surprised by his evident happiness, and those who had heard whispers of Elena's difficult circumstances under Margaret's care found themselves, on the whole, sympathetic to a young woman who had endured genuine hardship before finding unexpected shelter and, eventually, genuine love. Margaret, for her part, made no further attempt to insert herself into Elena's life following the hearing, her own reputation too thoroughly damaged by the revelations of her scheme with Blackwood to risk further public scrutiny. Elena occasionally wondered, in quiet moments, whether her stepmother felt any genuine remorse for the years of neglect and manipulation she had inflicted, though she suspected the answer mattered less to her own healing than she once might have believed. What mattered now was not Margaret's capacity for regret, but Elena's own capacity to build a life entirely separate from the shadow her stepmother had once cast over every corner of her existence. As the engagement period progressed, Elena found herself settling more fully into the rhythms of Ashcombe Hall, no longer as a guest uncertain of her welcome, but as a woman genuinely building a home and a future within its walls. She spent long afternoons in the library, no longer merely borrowing books but selecting additions to the collection herself, a practice that delighted the Duke as much as it delighted her. She grew close with Lucy and the other household staff, no longer treated with the careful distance reserved for a temporary guest, but welcomed as the future mistress of a house that had, in its own quiet way, been waiting for someone like her to bring warmth back into its grand, echoing halls. And in the evenings, when the day's business had concluded, and the household had settled into quiet, Elena and the Duke often sat together in the same drawing room, where she had first been offered a chair, before a single word of judgment, talking softly of the future they intended to build together, a future neither of them could have imagined, on that first cold night, when a cruel prank had, against every expectation, become the beginning of something neither of them had dared to hope for. The wedding took place on a clear autumn morning, the grounds of Ashcombe Hall transformed with garlands of late-blooming flowers gathered from the very gardens where Elena and the Duke had walked so many times during their courtship. Elena stood at the entrance of the small chapel on the estate grounds, dressed in a gown far finer than anything she had ever imagined wearing, and yet the thing she found herself thinking of most, as she waited for the ceremony to begin, was not the fine silk against her skin, or the assembled guests filling the pews, but the simple wooden chair the Duke had pulled forward for her on that very first night, offered before he knew anything about her beyond the exhaustion and fear written across her face. Lucy, who had become something between a maid and a genuine friend over these past months, helped adjust the final details of Elena's gown, her eyes bright with unshed tears of happiness. "Never did I imagine, that first strange night you arrived, mismatched dress and all, that we would end up here today," Lucy admitted, smoothing a final fold of fabric into place. "Nor did I," Elena agreed softly. "Though I confess, some part of me suspected something significant had shifted the moment he offered me that chair, instead of turning me away. He's never been the same man since you arrived, you know," Lucy said. "Quieter men sometimes carry the deepest feelings, and our Duke has certainly proven that true these past months." The ceremony itself passed in a warm blur for Elena, the Duke's steady, familiar presence beside her, grounding her through the formal vows and traditions, until finally they were pronounced husband and wife before the small gathering of friends, tenants, and household staff who had come to witness the joining of two people whose paths had crossed under such unlikely circumstances. Afterward, as the celebration moved to the grand hall, where Elena had first stood trembling in her mismatched dress, she found herself pausing near the very spot where that first chair had been offered, now decorated with ribbons and flowers for the occasion. The Duke, noticing her attention drawn to that particular corner of the hall, came to stand beside her, following her gaze. "I still think of that night sometimes," he admitted quietly, "of how close I came to simply sending you away without a second thought, the way so many others might have done in my position." "Why didn't you?" Elena asked, a question she had wondered about often over these past months, but had never quite found the right moment to voice aloud. The Duke considered the question seriously before answering. "Because you looked exhausted and afraid, and something in me could not bear to add to that fear. Regardless of whatever strange circumstances had brought you to my door, I did not yet know your name, nor the cruelty you had endured, nor anything at all about your character. I only knew that a person standing before me needed a moment of rest and dignity before facing whatever explanation the situation required, and offering that seemed the only decent response available to me. That small decency changed the entire course of my life," Elena said softly, reaching for his hand. "I do not think you fully understand what it meant, arriving somewhere expecting only humiliation, and instead being offered a simple chair, and kindness, before a single word had even been exchanged between us." "Perhaps I do understand, at least in part," the Duke said, squeezing her hand gently, "because that same small moment changed the course of my life as well, in ways I did not anticipate that night, watching a stranger sit trembling in my hall, carrying a letter she was too afraid to read." As the celebration continued around them, the household staff mingling freely with the invited guests in a manner that would have scandalized more formal gatherings, but felt entirely fitting for the warmth that had come to define Ashcombe Hall under Elena's growing influence. Elena found herself reflecting on the strange, winding path that had brought her to this moment. A cruel prank, intended to humiliate and diminish her, had instead delivered her into the hands of a man whose own quiet decency had reshaped everything she believed possible for her own life. She thought of Margaret, somewhere far from these celebrations, likely still nursing whatever bitterness remained from the loss of both the inheritance she had schemed to control and the marriage arrangement she had hoped to broker for her own benefit. Elena found she felt no particular anger toward her stepmother in this moment, only a quiet, distant pity for a woman who had spent so much energy trying to diminish someone else, never understanding that true worth could not actually be stolen or controlled by another person's cruelty, only temporarily obscured by it. Later that evening, as the guests began to depart and the household settled into the quiet aftermath of celebration, Elena and the Duke walked together through the gardens one final time before retiring, the autumn air cool and crisp against their skin, the stars beginning to emerge overhead in the darkening sky. "Do you have any regrets?" the Duke asked quietly, "about how all of this began, about the cruelty that first brought you to my gates, however differently it ultimately resolved?" Elena considered the question seriously, turning it over in her mind as they walked. "I regret the years of neglect and manipulation that preceded that night, certainly. I regret that Margaret ever had the power to cause me such harm in the first place. But that specific night, the prank itself, the terror of that carriage ride, and the shame of that mismatched dress, I find I cannot entirely regret it, strange as that may sound. It led me here, to you, to a life I could never have imagined for myself under different circumstances." "Then perhaps," the Duke said, drawing her close as they paused beneath the wide branches of an old oak tree at the edge of the garden, "we might consider it this way. Whatever cruelty set these events in motion, what ultimately determined their outcome, was not the prank itself, but the choice made in response to it. A choice to offer dignity rather than judgment, safety rather than further harm. That choice, however small it seemed in the moment, proved far more powerful than the cruelty that preceded it." Elena smiled up at him, understanding the truth in his words completely. "A chair, offered before a single word was spoken," she said softly, echoing the phrase that had come to define the beginning of everything between them. "And a life built together, one small choice at a time, ever since," the Duke added, leaning down to press a gentle kiss to her forehead, as the stars continued their slow emergence overhead, marking the quiet close of a day that had begun with vows spoken before witnesses, and would continue, Elena knew with growing certainty, in countless small and significant choices yet to come, each one building upon the foundation laid that very first night, when kindness had triumphed so completely, and so unexpectedly, over cruelty. In the years that followed, the story of how Elena had arrived at Ashcombe Hall as the unwitting subject of a cruel prank, only to be met with a chair and quiet dignity rather than the humiliation intended for her, became something of a quiet legend throughout the county, told and retold, not as a tale of scandal, but as a testament to the power of simple decency to reshape even the most difficult beginnings into something entirely unexpected and profoundly good. Elena herself, in the comfort of the home she had come to genuinely call her own, never tired of remembering that first strange evening, nor of appreciating how thoroughly one small act of kindness, offered without judgment or expectation, had changed the entire course of her life.